Don Huff, WBZ News Radio 1030.
And now the CBS Evening News.
Good evening. We saw something today
On WBZ News Radio 1030.
Tonight, and incredible.
The CBS Evening News.
Dramatic audio surfaces.
Now twice every weekday evening.
Reports tonight from the scene of a...
At 6:30 p.m. and again at 7:30 p.m.
Another major story tonight, the Boston...
Now twice every weekday evening.
Most Americans... This is the CBS Evening News. The great WBZ.
The News Watch never stops.
WBZ News Radio 1030.
Greetings and welcome. It's hour number 2 of the Jordan Rich Show. That would be me, and it's great to be with you. And as, of course, the case, we cover a variety of topics and just go all over the map because that's fun. I mean, come on. I hate to be sitting around just doing the same thing all the time. Life is too frenetic and fun and filled with all kinds of possibilities. So to that end, we have a gentleman on the phone. His name is Ned Hayes, best-selling author. He's got a book called Sinful Folk. Now, when you look at the book, when you actually pick it up and hold it, you realize something going on here, and it's not necessarily something very, very current and modern, and yet there's something very, very much current about the theme. It's called Sinful Folk. It takes place in 1377. So welcome to 2015 there, Ned.
Well, thanks so much. It's nice to be up to date.
Thank you very much. You're getting a lot of a press on this, and people love this kind of thing. And I guess it's based on an actual event back in 1377?
Yes, I studied medieval literature in Chaucer back in the 1990s, a few years ago, not many centuries ago, and I heard about a very unusual incident in which a group of people took their dead children after they died in a house fire across England. And at that time, traveling across England was like going to the moon. I mean, peasants just did not do this. So I was really intrigued by it.
Now, why would they take their children, God forbid, their deceased children on such a trip?
Well, it's a terrible thing. I think grief can strike us in a lot of different ways. I found in the history there was no explanation. So, of course, like a good novelist, I made one up. And my explanation, of course, was that the people who actually started the fire left the village in order to escape suspicion and to kind of point a finger elsewhere and say, you know, some other people did this. Maybe the Moors, the Jews, you know, other people who are outsiders. And all too often, I think today, that impulse is still there.
I remember reading Echo's Name of the Rose well back many years ago, and it became a huge bestseller. And there's something, well, first of all, if you're a good writer as you are, there's something intriguing about the human condition and the need to know, to answer a mystery, no matter when it is. I mean, cavemen or present day, right?
Right. And in fact, you can write a novel about an actual historical event where you know, for example, that the Allies won World War II, or you know that 9/11 happened, but finding out why it mattered to the characters in your novel or what was actually happening at the time, it continues to make an intriguing story for us today. We want to know why. We want to know why these people care.
Sinful Folk, the 14th century. So what do we know about the 14th century beyond the basics? I mean, what do we know? How do people dress? How long do they live? That kind of thing.
Well, I think a lot of our knowledge of the 14th century today is filtered through kind of Monty Python's Holy Grail, where we have, you know, fake horses and knights and peasants and all of that. But if you actually go into the history, the peasants were very constrained. They were almost like slaves in a way. They could not leave a certain village, a piece of property, without permission. Noble people didn't act very nobly. They were often in the business of just taking care of their own property, like maybe some people say the 1% is today. It was a much smaller 1% then. And so at that time, the social stratification was very harsh, but the control of the church was pretty loose. So if you wanted to have more free expression and you wanted to speak about intellectual matters and actually be more of a middle-class person, you often joined the church. It gave you a place of privilege. It gave you kind of a middle-class living, and you had a lot of routes to learn things.
You mean join the church as a parishioner?
No.
Or as a member of the professional church, in other words.
A member of the professional church,
Right.
a monk, a nun, somebody like that.
Yeah, they had the respect in the community. They also, because they were sheltered, perhaps, might have enjoyed a better quality of life, would you say? I mean, disease
Absolutely.
might not have been as prevalent, and food might have been better, I mean, because they were more cloistered and, set aside.
Well, the church had many more democratic principles inside of it at that time, in that you could, as a monk inside a monastery, establish what sort of rule the monastery wanted to follow. And you could travel, and you could own property, etc. And a peasant at that time couldn't. So it kind of changes things around when you start to think of the church and being a professional churchman as kind of a refuge for somebody who wanted an intellectual escape or wanted to actually understand what it was like to own property.
By the way, this also is a story, Sinful Folk, and this is something that happens throughout history and great stories. A man or a woman pretending to be a man or a woman.
Absolutely.
So you have a situation, you have a heroine here, a nun, correct?
Well, she started as a nun, but
Yep.
when the book opens, she is a mute man, and she's been living that way for about 10 years. What was surprising to me as I researched it is that there were a number of women throughout the Middle Ages and in Renaissance history as well who did this for exactly the reasons that my protagonist
And that would be
disguises herself.
And that would be to protect herself, or what?
To protect herself, and also to give herself some of that power and privilege, which women at that time were not allowed to have. So she was able to step into a role, and people allowed her to fill it. And what's kind of interesting, if you read the history, is that oftentimes people kind of winked and nodded, and they were like, yeah, we know that's kind of a woman, but she's acting like a guy, she's dressing like a guy. We'll just let her go through with it. So it's very interesting.
Yeah, they didn't have cell phone cameras back then, so I suppose you could get away with a bit more. And we're talking with Ned Hayes. His new novel, Sinful Folk, takes place in the 14th century, in 1377, actual historic events. And I was thinking about children and about childbirth and the fact that so many children died in childbirth, or so many mothers died in childbirth. It's really amazing that the human race was able to move forward in any of these times before we had all the modern medical conveniences we have today, but yet people persevered.
It's true. It's true. In fact, there's a line in the novel where my main character says, "What mother has never cried over the grave of a child?" Because it was inconceivable that you would not have multiple children die before the age of 10, often before even 1 year old.
Right, and of course that's why women had multiple children, because the odds were they weren't going to all survive. We're talking here about a very interesting time, and people, the way they communicated, obviously they communicated orally and with some semblance of writing, but what kind of communication was written down? I mean, were there, I know Gutenberg around that time, but were there stories that were passed around? Were there books, the kind of books that we are familiar with today, you think?
Well, a lot of the tradition was oral. In fact, there's a whole medieval mystery play tradition, and they were only called mystery plays because we aren't quite sure who wrote them. But they were the stories from the Bible and from myth that were performed by average villagers and passed down from, say, a baker to his son, from the son to his grandson. So passed down the role and passed down the script that you said every year. And so this went around to all the different villages, and people learned the history that they knew from these oral drama productions on every street corner.
Interesting, and that's why those medieval troops that we see in movies, I mean, they probably were prevalent because they would perform all kinds of stage plays and oral history things, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And some people think that the stories in Chaucer and Shakespeare were in the common parlance at that time as well. That people knew them orally, people told them to each other, people told silly jokes that ended up, a couple centuries later in Shakespeare. But all of it, for for most peasants and for most people, was an oral tradition.
What about the government per se? Now, you're talking about a story of people traveling across England in 1377, and it's a horrendously difficult procedure. What kind of, I mean, besides the Sheriff of Nottingham types, what kind of government structure? Because we know that there's a king and there's royalty in a castle somewhere, but they're not really extending throughout the land, or are they?
Well, the kind of support structure that we have now, where we can send a message from Washington, D.C. across the country very quickly, of course, did not exist at that time. So if you wanted to send a message across England, which is only, a few hundred miles really, 450 at some spots, 200 other spots, it would take you a week, sometimes 2 weeks.
Sure.
And so your line of support for someone out in the field who had to levy a tax or had to change a rule was very, very difficult to support. Now, I just want to back up a second, because you asked about language and about telling stories.
Yes.
And one conception in the Middle Ages that's important to point out is that most of the educated people knew that they were standing on the ruins of a huge Roman civilization, and that this civilization had multiple languages, had a much better system of government, much better sanitary conditions, and so they felt like they were dwarfs standing on the shoulders of fallen giants. And so the educated people knew this, and they kept learning as much knowledge as they could in the hopes to preserve it. So my main character, for example, besides hiding her voice and her gender, she also hides her knowledge. She can speak and read 3 or 4 languages, and yet in the village, everybody thinks she's just a mute peasant.
Yeah, it's almost.
And they also think she's kind of dumb.
Ned Hayes is here. His novel Sinful Folk is getting a lot of attention. It takes place in the Middle Ages, 1377. So think about this. It's 120 years before Columbus, for crying out loud, has moved into the New World. It's when does the bubonic plague break out? Is that before or after? It's after this, isn't it?
It's just after this.
Yeah. So
about the time. Yeah.
Okay, but still, you're not dealing with sanitation as we know it even 100, 200 years later. So you're dealing with a pretty raunchy kind of living arrangement where disease is prevalent. And I asked you earlier, what was the average lifespan? 35, 40 if you were lucky?
Right. If you were 45, you were an old man or an old woman.
Wow. And what about Scavengers and Marauders? I haven't read the book through yet, but are there dangers, I would imagine, from not just nature, but from humans?
Absolutely. In fact, several early readers mentioned that they felt the novel was almost too brutal, in that they kept meeting people who just wanted to take away the little that they had on their travels. And yet, when I look back at the historical record, the kind of encounters that people actually had on the open road were actually more brutal than the novel. So I felt like I made it a little bit more palatable for the modern palate. But, it wasn't an easy time to live, and it wasn't an easy time to get along. If you wanted to go out on the open road, you should probably take about 30 armed knights with you.
I say, yeah, the open road travel of 1377 was fraught with all kinds of dangers. And it's an interesting little sidebar here, the way you wrote this and the time that you took to think about it. It says here you're a pretty important, Intel? Is that who you work for when you're not writing?
Right.
So you're a commuter, right? And you would go to and from work, and were you in a car or in a train or?
No, I take a commuter train from the South Sound up to the Seattle offices of Intel.
Okay.
And on that train, I have an hour, sometimes an hour and a half every morning, an hour and a half on the way back, and I just sit there with my notebook and write it, and then sometimes with my laptop later. And just writing those 2 hours every day, at the end of a year, I had a complete draft of a manuscript of a novel.
It's good for you. Of course, it doesn't hurt to be a scholar in this area, but still, that's really nice. And it's also, one more thing, it's illustrated. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so I was fortunate to work with Nikki McClure, who's a New York Times bestselling author and illustrator, and she did a wonderful hand-cut cover for the novel, as well as 8 different internal illustrations to illustrate different sections of the book. I love the cover that she created because it feels like something that could be done in the 1400s or even in 1377 when the novel takes place, because it is just black paper cut out very finely with a blade. And it demonstrates the kind of stark contrast with the black and white on the cover.
Yeah, no, it's very, very impressive. It stands out, no question about that. In an era when everything's bright and colorful and over the top, it's very simple but gets the point across. It's called Sinful Folk, Ned Hayes, a novel of the Middle Ages, 1377, and yeah, it's a little bit raw and rash, and it's also filled with hope and even a little bit of humor. Ned, thank you so much for joining us. Good luck with this, and thanks for taking us back a few years to a time when, well, we didn't have Purell, so we couldn't wash our hands. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks so much for having me. Take care.
Take care of yourself. Right. We'll take a short time out, and we have open lines again